Reba Mcentire throws surprise party for her granddaughter, and her reaction moved everyone. No one could hold back tears when they saw what happened that Sunday afternoon. The silence in Kelly's bedroom was deafening as she stared at her phone screen, reading the same text message for the 100th time that morning. "Sorry, sweetheart. Can't make it to your birthday. Studio session's running late. We'll make it up to you soon. Love, Grandma Reba." The words felt like tiny daggers piercing through her heart, each letter confirming what she had suspected for months. She was no longer important in her grandmother's life. Kelly Thompson had turned 15 just last year, surrounded by the warmth of her famous grandmother's embrace, basking in the glow of being Reba Mcentire's beloved granddaughter. But now, as her 16th birthday approached like a storm cloud on the horizon, everything felt different. The woman who once called her little star and promised they would conquer Nashville together now seemed like a distant memory, a stranger hiding behind tour schedules and recording contracts. The morning sunlight filtered through her bedroom curtains, illuminating the shrine she had built over the years. Framed photos of her and Reba at award shows, backstage passes from countless concerts, and handwritten notes from her grandmother that used to arrive weekly but had dwindled to nothing. Kelly picked up her favorite photograph, taken 3 years ago at the Grand Ole Opry, where a 13-year-old version of herself stood proudly next to the country music legend, both wearing matching cowboy hats and genuine smiles that could light up the entire stage. "Those were different times," she whispered to herself, tracing her finger along the glass frame. Back then, Reba would call every Sunday morning without fail, their conversations lasting hours as they discussed music, life, and Kelly's dreams of following in her grandmother's footsteps. They would write songs together over video calls, Reba teaching Kelly the intricacies of melody and storytelling that had made her one of the most respected artists in country music history. But something had shifted dramatically over the past 2 years. The phone calls became sporadic, then monthly, then almost non-existent. The promised visits to Nashville turned into rain checks that never materialized. The collaborative songwriting sessions that Kelly cherished more than anything in the world simply stopped. It was as if a switch had been flipped, transforming the most important relationship in Kelly's life into a series of brief text messages and missed connections. If you're enjoying this emotional journey with Kelly and Reba, we would love to hear from you. Please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what you think Kelly should do about this heartbreaking situation. Your engagement means the world to us, and we love connecting with our amazing community of storytelling enthusiasts from around the globe. Kelly's mother, Sarah, had tried to explain the situation countless times. "Honey, your grandmother is at the peak of her career right now. The international tour, the new album, the television appearances, it's all consuming her time. She loves you just as much as she always has." But Kelly couldn't shake the feeling that she had somehow disappointed the woman she idolized, that perhaps her own musical aspirations weren't good enough to deserve Reba's attention anymore. The teenager had spent countless nights lying awake, wondering what she had done wrong. Had she been too presumptuous when she sent those demo recordings to her grandmother last Christmas? Had she overstepped some invisible boundary by assuming they would always have that special connection? The questions tormented her, creating a deep well of insecurity that seemed to grow larger with each passing day. Kelly walked over to her keyboard, the instrument that had become her closest confidant in recent months. Her fingers found the familiar keys, and she began playing the melody she had been working on for weeks, a song that poured out her heart in ways she couldn't express in words. The lyrics spoke of a love that felt one-sided, of dreams that seemed to be slipping away, and of the profound loneliness that comes from feeling forgotten by someone who once made you feel like the most important person in the world. The song had become her secret project, something she worked on late at night when the rest of the world was asleep. She called it Grandma's Shadow, and it told the story of a girl who grew up believing she was special, only to discover that perhaps she had been living in an illusion all along. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, with a vulnerability that would have made any music producer take notice, but Kelly kept it hidden, too afraid of the rejection that might follow if she shared it with anyone. Her phone buzzed with messages from friends asking about her birthday plans. Madison wanted to know if there would be a big party with celebrity guests, assuming that being Reba Mcentire's granddaughter automatically meant access to the glamorous world of country music. Tyler jokingly asked if his favorite songs would be performed live by the Queen herself, But Kelly found herself making excuses, downplaying the significance of her special day because the truth was too painful to admit. Her famous grandmother wouldn't be there. The irony wasn't lost on Kelly that while millions of people around the world would give anything for just 5 minutes with Reba Mcentire, she, the woman's own flesh and blood, couldn't even get a phone call returned. She had watched countless interviews where Reba spoke passionately about the importance of family, about how her loved ones always came first, and about the values that kept her grounded despite her massive success. Yet somehow, Kelly felt like she had been written out of that narrative entirely. Sarah knocked on the bedroom door, interrupting Kelly's melancholy thoughts. "Sweetie, I know you're disappointed about your grandmother not being here for your birthday, but I have an idea. What if we surprise her at the studio tomorrow? I spoke with her manager, and they're wrapping up the final tracks for her new album. Maybe we could at least get a quick visit in before your actual birthday celebration." Kelly's heart skipped a beat at the possibility, but she quickly suppressed the hope that threatened to rise in her chest. She had learned the hard way that expectations only led to disappointment when it came to her grandmother's availability. Still, the thought of seeing Reba even briefly was too appealing to dismiss entirely. "I don't know, Mum. What if she's too busy? What if we're just interrupting something important?" Kelly's voice carried the weight of months of accumulated hurt, the careful protection she had built around her heart to shield herself from further rejection. "Kelly Thompson, you listen to me," Sarah said, sitting on the edge of her daughter's bed with the firm but loving tone that mothers perfect over the years. "You are not an interruption. You are not a burden. You are Reba Mcentire's granddaughter, and no recording session, no matter how important, is more significant than that relationship. I know things have felt different lately, but sometimes we need to take that first step to bridge the gap." Kelly looked at her mother, seeing the determination in her eyes and recognizing the same stubbornness that ran through their family line, the same trait that had propelled Reba from a small town in Oklahoma to the pinnacle of country music success. Maybe her mother was right. Maybe it was time to stop waiting for her grandmother to make the first move and instead take control of her own destiny. The rest of the day passed in a blur of nervous energy and conflicted emotions. Kelly found herself alternating between excitement at the prospect of seeing her grandmother and terror at the possibility of another awkward, rushed encounter that would only confirm her worst fears. She practiced what she might say, rehearsed casual conversation starters, and even considered bringing her notebook with the lyrics to Grandma's Shadow, though she quickly dismissed that idea as too risky. As evening approached, Kelly made a decision that surprised even herself. She was going to go to that studio, not as the desperate granddaughter begging for attention, but as Kelly Thompson, a young woman with her own dreams, her own voice, and her own worth that existed independently of anyone else's validation. Tomorrow would mark not just her 16th birthday, but perhaps the beginning of a new chapter in her relationship with the woman who had shaped so much of her identity. Little did Kelly know that at that very moment, hundreds of miles away in Nashville, Reba Mcentire was putting the finishing touches on the most elaborate surprise of her entire career, one that would change everything Kelly believed about their relationship and reveal the depth of a grandmother's love that had never wavered, even when it seemed absent. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel possible again. Kelly woke up with butterflies dancing in her stomach, unsure whether they were born from excitement or anxiety about the impromptu visit to her grandmother's recording studio. She had barely slept, her mind racing through countless scenarios of how their reunion might unfold. Sarah had already called ahead to confirm that Reba would be at the studio, though she kept the conversation deliberately vague to avoid raising any suspicions. "Just tell her we're in the neighborhood and wanted to drop by," she had instructed Kelly's mother, though they both knew that being in the neighborhood of a Nashville recording studio required a 3-hour drive from their home in Tennessee. As they drove through the winding roads leading to Music City, Kelly found herself remembering the first time her grandmother had brought her to a professional recording studio. She was only 8 years old then, wide-eyed and mesmerized by the technical equipment, the sound engineers working their magic behind glass panels, and most importantly, watching Reba transform into the artist the world knew and loved. "Do you remember when you told me you wanted to be just like Grandma Reba?" Sarah asked, glancing at her daughter through the rearview mirror as they navigated the familiar streets of Nashville. Kelly smiled, despite her nervousness. I remember telling her I wanted to be better than her, actually. I was so confident back then. The memory brought a bittersweet ache to her chest. That 8-year-old version of herself had possessed an unshakable belief in her own destiny, a certainty that she and her grandmother would conquer the music world together. "What changed, sweetheart?" Sarah's voice was gentle, probing, the way mothers ask questions when they already suspect they know the answer, but want their children to discover it for themselves. Kelly was quiet for a long moment, watching the Nashville skyline grow larger through the windshield. "I guess I realized that wanting something and deserving it are two different things. Maybe I was just a little girl with big dreams who didn't understand how the real world works." The recording studio was located in a nondescript building that could have housed any type of business, its anonymity designed to protect the privacy of the artists who created magic within its walls. As they pulled into the parking lot, Kelly's heart began beating so fast she was certain her mother could hear it. There, parked in the spot closest to the entrance, was Reba's distinctive black pickup truck, the same vehicle that had taken them on countless adventures during Kelly's childhood. Sarah noticed her daughter's hesitation and reached over to squeeze her hand. "Remember what I told you yesterday. You belong here, Kelly. Not because of your last name, not because of who your grandmother is, but because of who you are." The receptionist at the front desk recognized them immediately, her face lighting up with the kind of genuine warmth that suggested she had heard many stories about Reba's beloved granddaughter. "Kelly, my goodness, you've grown so much since the last time I saw you. Reba is in Studio B, but let me call back and let her know you're here." As they waited in the lobby, surrounded by gold records and photographs of country music legends, Kelly felt the familiar mixture of pride and intimidation that came with being connected to such an iconic figure. Every surface seemed to tell a story of success, of dreams realized and careers built on talent and determination. It was both inspiring and overwhelming, a constant reminder of the legacy she felt simultaneously connected to and excluded from. "She'll be right out," the receptionist announced with a smile that seemed to hold secrets Kelly couldn't quite decipher. The minutes stretched like hours until finally the door to the back hallway opened and Reba Mcentire emerged. At 68 years old, she still commanded attention the moment she entered any room, her red hair perfectly styled despite having spent hours in the studio, her signature smile intact, even though Kelly could detect a hint of something else in her eyes. Was it nervousness? Guilt? Or perhaps something Kelly couldn't identify because she no longer knew her grandmother well enough to read her expressions? "Well, would you look at what the cat dragged in?" Reba said, her Oklahoma accent as warm and familiar as a childhood lullaby. She approached them with arms outstretched, but Kelly noticed a slight hesitation in her movements, as if she too was uncertain about the current state of their relationship. The hug that followed was everything Kelly had hoped for and everything she had feared. It felt like coming home and saying goodbye at the same time. Reba held her tightly, and for a moment Kelly could pretend that nothing had changed between them, that they were still the inseparable pair who used to spend entire weekends writing songs and sharing dreams. "Happy early birthday, little star," Reba whispered into Kelly's ear, using the nickname that had once made her feel like the most special person in the world, but somehow, hearing it now, only emphasized how long it had been since she had felt truly special to her grandmother. "Thanks, Grandma," Kelly replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Mom thought we'd surprise you while we were in town." Reba's eyes flickered towards Sarah with an expression Kelly couldn't quite interpret. Was it gratitude? Annoyance? Relief? The interaction lasted only a split second, but it was enough to make Kelly feel like there was something she wasn't being told, some adult conversation happening in glances and subtle gestures that excluded her entirely. "Well, I'm so glad you did," Reba said, though her tone carried a slight tension that Kelly's finely tuned ear for her grandmother's moods immediately detected. "I was just finishing up some vocal tracks for the new album. Would you like to hear what I've been working on?" Kelly nodded enthusiastically, following her grandmother down the hallway toward Studio B. The familiar scent of coffee and leather, mixed with the subtle electronic hum of professional recording equipment, brought back a flood of memories from her childhood visits. But there was something different about this visit, an underlying current of unspoken tension that made every interaction feel staged and careful. Studio B was exactly as Kelly remembered it, a controlled environment where raw emotion was transformed into polished art. Reba gestured for them to sit on the leather couch, while she moved toward the mixing board with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had spent decades perfecting her craft in similar rooms. "This is the title track from my new album," Reba explained, adjusting various knobs and sliders with practiced precision. "It's called Coming Home to You, and it's about the people who matter most when everything else falls away." As the music began to play, Kelly found herself transported by her grandmother's voice, still as powerful and emotionally resonant as ever. The song spoke of long roads and distant stages, of success that sometimes came at a cost, and of the realization that home was not a place but the people who loved you unconditionally. It was beautiful, haunting, and deeply personal in a way that made Kelly wonder if the lyrics were meant as some kind of message. When the song ended, the silence in the studio felt heavy with unspoken words. Kelly wanted to tell her grandmother how beautiful the song was, how proud she was of her continued success, how much she missed their old closeness. But instead, she found herself asking the question that had been burning inside her for months. "Grandma, have I done something wrong?" The words hung in the air like a challenge, raw and vulnerable in a way that made both Sarah and Reba freeze. Kelly hadn't planned to be so direct, but something about hearing that song, about being in this space where so many of their precious memories had been created, made it impossible to continue pretending that everything was normal. Reba's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, pain, guilt, and something else that Kelly couldn't identify. For a moment, the mask of the successful entertainer slipped away, revealing the woman underneath who was clearly struggling with her own complicated emotions. "Oh, sweetheart," Reba began, her voice softer than Kelly had heard it in years. "You haven't done anything wrong, not a single thing. If anyone has made mistakes here, it's me." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite sure how to cross. Kelly felt her eyes fill with tears she had been holding back for months, while Reba looked more vulnerable than the teenager had ever seen her. Sarah sat quietly, recognizing that this was a conversation that needed to happen between grandmother and granddaughter without interference. "Then why does it feel like you don't want me around anymore?" Kelly asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you stop calling? Why did you stop caring?" Reba moved closer, kneeling in front of the couch so she was at eye level with her granddaughter. "Kelly Thompson, I have never stopped caring about you for one single second of one single day. If anything, I care too much, and that's been the problem." The confession was so unexpected, so different from what Kelly had been telling herself for months, that she felt her entire understanding of the situation begin to shift. But before either of them could say more, the studio door opened and a man in an expensive suit entered, clearly expecting to find Reba alone. "Reba, we need to discuss the schedule for tomorrow's," he began, then stopped abruptly when he noticed Kelly and Sarah. His expression shifted to one of barely concealed irritation. "I didn't realize you had company." The interruption shattered the intimate moment like glass, and Kelly watched as her grandmother's face immediately transformed back into its professional mask. Whatever conversation they had been about to have, whatever truth was on the verge of being revealed, was suddenly postponed by the demands of Reba's career, just as Kelly had feared it would be. "Marcus, this is my granddaughter Kelly, and my daughter-in-law Sarah," Reba said, her voice taking on the polished tone she reserved for business interactions. Kelly felt her heart sink as she watched her grandmother slip back into the role of the untouchable celebrity. The vulnerable woman who had been kneeling before her just moments ago seeming to evaporate into thin air. Marcus Hendricks, Reba's longtime manager, barely glanced at Kelly before turning his attention back to his client. "We really need to finalize the details for tomorrow's recording session. The backup singers will be here at 8, and we still haven't confirmed the final arrangements for the orchestral pieces." Kelly felt invisible as the conversation shifted to schedules, contracts, and logistics. This was exactly what she had been experiencing for the past 2 years, being present in body but absent in importance, watching her grandmother's attention get pulled away by the endless demands of a career that seemed to consume everything in its path. Sarah noticed her daughter's expression and stood up, recognizing the familiar pattern that had damaged the relationship between Kelly and Reba. "Perhaps we should go, Kelly. Your grandmother obviously has important business to attend to." But something unexpected happened. Instead of allowing them to leave gracefully, as she had done so many times before, Reba held up her hand in a gesture that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. "Marcus, whatever it is can wait 30 minutes, she said firmly, her voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "This is my granddaughter's birthday weekend, and for the first time in too long, She's here with me. The backup singers and orchestral arrangements will still be there in half an hour. Marcus's expression shifted to barely contained frustration, but he had worked with Reba long enough to recognize when she had made a non-negotiable decision. Fine, but we really can't push this any later. The studio time alone is costing us— I don't care what it's costing us, Reba interrupted, her voice rising with an edge that Kelly had rarely heard directed at anyone other than family members who had pushed her too far. Some things are more important than money, Marcus. I thought you understood that by now. Kelly felt her breath catch in her throat. She had never seen her grandmother prioritize her over business concerns, and the gesture felt both wonderful and terrifying. What if this moment of defiance against her schedule only made Reba resent her more? What if she was causing problems that would drive an even bigger wedge between them? Marcus gathered his papers with obvious annoyance and headed toward the door. "I'll be in the lobby when you're ready to discuss reality instead of sentiment," he said, his words dripping with the kind of professional, passive aggression that Kelly instinctively disliked. As the door closed behind him, the studio fell silent except for the quiet hum of electronic equipment. Reba stood in the middle of the room, looking suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. She ran her hands through her famous red hair and let out a long breath that seemed to carry the weight of years. "I'm sorry you had to see that," she said finally, addressing both Kelly and Sarah, but looking directly at her granddaughter. "Marcus means well, but sometimes he forgets that I'm a person first and a business entity second." Kelly found herself studying her grandmother with new eyes. For the first time in years, she was seeing Reba not as the untouchable country music legend, but as a woman struggling to balance the demands of an extraordinary career with the desire to maintain meaningful relationships. It was a perspective that had never occurred to her before, and it was both enlightening and heartbreaking. "Grandma," Kelly began carefully, "I don't want to cause problems for you. If you need to take care of business—" "Stop right there," Reba said, moving closer and taking Kelly's hands in hers. "The fact that you're worried about causing problems for me is exactly why I've been such a fool these past couple of years. Kelly, sweetheart, you are not a problem. You never have been, and you never will be." The words were exactly what Kelly had been longing to hear, but they also raised more questions than they answered. If she wasn't a problem, then why had their relationship changed so dramatically? Why had the phone calls stopped and the visits become so rare and awkward? Sarah, who had been quietly observing the interaction, decided to ask the question that Kelly couldn't quite formulate. "Reba, can you help us understand what's been happening? Kelly has been so hurt by what she perceives as your withdrawal from her life. She thinks she's done something wrong, but I know that can't be true." Reba closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering the courage to say something she had been avoiding for too long. When she opened them again, Kelly saw a vulnerability there that was both surprising and familiar. The same look her grandmother used to get when she talked about the early days of her career, when success was uncertain and every decision felt like it carried enormous weight. "The truth is," Reba began slowly, "I've been trying to protect Kelly from something that I didn't think she was ready to handle. But in trying to protect her, I ended up hurting her in ways I never intended." Kelly felt her heart racing as she waited for her grandmother to continue. This was the conversation she had been craving for months, but now that it was happening, she wasn't sure she was prepared for whatever truth was about to be revealed. "2 years ago, I made a decision about Kelly's future that I thought was in her best interest," Reba continued, her voice growing stronger as she committed to the revelation. "But it meant that I had to step back from our relationship in ways that were painful for both of us. I thought it would be easier for her if she didn't feel pressured by having a famous grandmother who might overshadow her own talents." The confession hung in the air like smoke, visible but not quite solid enough to grasp completely. Kelly felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to fall into place, but the complete picture was still frustratingly unclear. "What kind of decision?" Kelly asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Reba looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly, as if giving her permission to reveal something they had discussed privately. "Kelly, do you remember that demo recording you sent me last Christmas? The 3 songs you had written and recorded in your bedroom?" Kelly's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Those recordings had been rough, imperfect attempts at songwriting that she had sent to her grandmother in a moment of vulnerability and hope. When Reba had barely acknowledged receiving them, Kelly had assumed they were disappointing. Further confirmation that she didn't have the talent to follow in her grandmother's footsteps. "I remember," Kelly said quietly. You never really said what you thought of them. That's because I was speechless, Reba said, her eyes filling with tears. Kelly, those songs were extraordinary. Not just good for a 14-year-old, but genuinely professionally extraordinary. The melody lines, the lyrics, the emotional depth. They showed a level of talent that most artists spend decades trying to develop. Kelly felt her world tilt on its axis. This was the opposite of everything she had believed about her grandmother's reaction to her music. But if you thought they were good, why didn't you? Because I knew what would happen if I told you, Reba interrupted. I knew that if I praised those songs the way they deserved to be praised, you would want to dive headfirst into the music industry. And Kelly, this business, it's beautiful and terrible and wonderful and devastating all at the same time. I wanted you to have a childhood, a normal teenage experience, before you had to face the reality of what this career can do to a person. The explanation was so different from what Kelly had imagined that she felt dizzy trying to process it. Her grandmother hadn't been dismissive of her talent. She had been trying to protect her from it. The distance that Kelly had interpreted as rejection had actually been an attempt at preservation. "So you've been staying away to protect me?" Kelly asked, her voice filled with a mixture of understanding and frustration. "I thought if I stepped back, you would focus on school, on being a regular teenager, on discovering who Kelly Thompson is separate from being Reba Mcentire's granddaughter," Reba explained. "I thought I was giving you the gift of a normal life, but I realize now that I was actually taking away something much more important, the certainty that you are loved and valued for exactly who you are." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as she watched the conversation unfold between the two most important women in her life. This was the explanation she had been hoping for, the confirmation that Reba's distance had been motivated by love rather than indifference. Kelly stood up abruptly and walked to the window that overlooked the Nashville skyline. The city that had always represented her dreams looked different now, less intimidating, and more like a place where possibilities lived alongside challenges. She could feel her grandmother's eyes on her, waiting for a response that would determine the future of their relationship. "Grandma," Kelly said finally, turning back to face Reba, "I understand why you thought you were protecting me, but you can't make decisions about my life without including me in the conversation. These past 2 years, I felt like I was losing the most important person in my world. That hurt worse than any criticism of my music ever could have." Reba nodded, tears streaming down her face. "You're absolutely right, and I'm so sorry. I let my fear of this industry, my desire to protect you, blind me to what you actually needed from me. I forgot that being your grandmother isn't just about keeping you safe. It's about supporting your dreams and being there for you no matter what path you choose." The apology was everything Kelly had needed to hear, but it also opened the door to a bigger question that had been growing in her heart throughout this conversation. If her grandmother thought her music was truly exceptional, what did that mean for her future? What possibilities might exist that she had never dared to consider? Before she could ask, the studio door opened again, and Marcus reappeared with an expression of barely controlled impatience. But this time, Reba didn't transform back into her professional persona. Instead, she kept her eyes locked on Kelly's face, making it clear that their conversation was far from over. "Reba, I hate to interrupt, but we have a situation," Marcus said, his voice carrying an urgency that hadn't been there during his previous interruption. "The backup singers are here early, and they're asking questions about tomorrow's arrangements. Also, the catering company needs to know final numbers, and the lighting crew is waiting for approval on the setup." Kelly felt her stomach drop as the familiar pattern threatened to repeat itself. Just when she and her grandmother were finally connecting, the demands of Reba's career were pulling her away again. But as she prepared to gracefully excuse herself and her mother, something in Marcus's tone made her pause. There was something odd about his urgency, something that didn't quite ring true. Reba, however, seemed to understand exactly what Marcus was talking about. A smile played at the corners of her mouth as she looked between her manager and her granddaughter, and Kelly caught a glimpse of something in her grandmother's expression that looked almost mischievous. "You know what, Marcus? You're absolutely right," Reba said, standing up with renewed energy. "We do need to take care of those arrangements. Kelly, sweetheart, would you mind helping me with something? I could really use an extra pair of hands, and since you're here—" Kelly was confused by the sudden shift in her grandmother's demeanor, but she nodded eagerly. Any opportunity to spend more time with Reba, to continue rebuilding the bridge between them, was worth embracing. Sarah also seemed puzzled by the change in atmosphere. but she followed as Reba led them out of Studio B and down a hallway Kelly had never explored before. "Where exactly are we going?" Kelly asked, as they walked past several closed doors marked with various studio designations. "To Studio A," Reba replied, her voice carrying an excitement that seemed disproportionate to whatever task awaited them. "It's our largest recording space, and we need to check on a few things." As they approached the door marked Studio A, Kelly could hear voices and movement from inside. It sounded like there were quite a few people in there, which struck her as odd for what she assumed would be a routine check on equipment or arrangements. Marcus reached the door first and placed his hand on the handle, looking at Reba with an expression that seemed to be asking for confirmation. "Are you ready for this?" Reba asked Kelly, but her tone suggested she wasn't talking about checking on studio equipment. Before Kelly could respond, Marcus opened the door and the world suddenly exploded into light, sound, and motion. "Surprise!" erupted from what seemed like hundreds of voices as Kelly found herself staring into Studio A, which had been completely transformed into something she had never imagined. The recording studio had been converted into the most elaborate party space Kelly had ever seen. Streamers and balloons in her favorite colors, purple and gold, hung from every available surface. Professional lighting equipment cast a warm, magical glow over everything, making the entire space feel like something out of a fairy tale. Tables laden with food lined one wall, while a raised platform at the far end of the room had been set up as a stage, complete with professional sound equipment and instruments. But it wasn't the decorations that took Kelly's breath away. It was the people. The studio was filled with faces she recognized from album covers, magazine articles, and award show broadcasts. Country music legends stood alongside rising stars, producers she had read about in industry magazines, and musicians whose work she had studied and admired for years. At the center of it all, holding balloons and wearing genuine smiles of anticipation, were her school friends, extended family members, and neighbors from home. Kelly's legs felt weak as she tried to process what she was seeing. This wasn't just a surprise party. This was an event that would have taken months to plan and coordinate. The guest list alone represented a who's who of Nashville's music scene, people whose schedules were typically booked solid years in advance. "Happy 16th birthday, Kelly," Reba said, wrapping her arm around her granddaughter's shoulders as Kelly stood frozen in the doorway, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was witnessing. Madison, her best friend from school, rushed forward with tears streaming down her face. "Kelly, I can't believe you had no idea. I've been keeping this secret for 3 months and it was killing me." 3 months, Kelly repeated, her voice barely audible as she tried to understand the timeline. "But Grandma, yesterday you said you couldn't come to my birthday because of studio obligations." Reba's smile widened as she gestured toward the incredible scene before them. "Sweetheart, this studio obligation is your birthday party. Everything I've been working on, every late-night session, every mysterious meeting, it was all for this moment." As the initial shock began to wear off, Kelly started to notice details that made the reality of the situation even more extraordinary. Professional photographers moved discreetly through the crowd, documenting every moment. The catering wasn't just party food. It was an elaborate spread that looked like something from a high-end Nashville restaurant. The stage setup was sophisticated enough to support live performances by major artists. "Kelly, there's someone special who wants to meet you," Reba said, gently guiding her granddaughter toward a group of people near the stage. As they approached, Kelly realized she was about to meet Faith Hill, Tim McGraw, and Carrie Underwood, 3 artists whose music had provided the soundtrack to much of her teenage years. "So you're the young songwriter we've been hearing so much about," Faith Hill said, extending her hand with a warm smile. "Your grandmother has been sharing your demo recordings with some of us, and I have to say, we're all incredibly impressed." Kelly felt like she was living in a dream. The demo recordings that she thought had been dismissed or forgotten had apparently been shared with some of the biggest names in country music. The embarrassment she had felt about those imperfect bedroom recordings was quickly being replaced by a pride she had never allowed herself to feel before. "Those songs show real promise," Tim McGraw added, his famous voice carrying genuine encouragement. "The storytelling, the emotional honesty, that's not something you can teach. That comes from the heart." Carrie Underwood nodded in agreement. "We'd love to hear you perform something live if you're up for it. Reba mentioned that you've been working on some new material." Kelly's mind immediately went to Grandma's Shadow. the song she had been pouring her heart into for months, but the idea of performing it here, in front of this audience, felt both terrifying and incredibly appealing. The song that had begun as a lament about their broken relationship could now serve as a bridge back to the connection they were rebuilding. I have been working on something," Kelly admitted, glancing at her grandmother for encouragement. "But it's very personal. It's actually about you, Grandma, about us, about how I've been feeling." Reba's eyes filled with tears as she understood what Kelly was referring to. "Would you be willing to share it with us? I think I can guess which song you mean, and sweetheart, I would be honored to hear it." The crowd had begun to gather around them, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Kelly felt the weight of dozens of pairs of eyes on her, but instead of feeling intimidated, she found herself drawing strength from the support she could feel radiating from everyone present. Sarah appeared at her daughter's side, carrying the guitar case that Kelly suddenly realized her mother must have brought from the car without her noticing. "I thought you might want this," she said, with a knowing smile that suggested she too had been part of the elaborate planning process. As Kelly took her guitar from its case, her hands trembling slightly with nervous excitement, she noticed that the conversations throughout the studio had gradually quieted. Word was spreading that she was about to perform, and the industry professionals who had gathered to celebrate her birthday were preparing to listen with the kind of attention usually reserved for established artists. "This song is called Grandma's Shadow," Kelly announced, her voice carrying farther than she expected thanks to the professional sound system. "I wrote it during a time when I thought I had lost someone very important to me. I didn't understand then that sometimes love expresses itself in ways that are hard to recognize." As she positioned her fingers on the guitar strings, Kelly looked directly at her grandmother, who was standing in the front row with tears already streaming down her face. This wasn't just a performance. It was a conversation, a confession, and a reconciliation all wrapped into one moment that would define their relationship going forward. The first notes of the song filled the studio, and Kelly's voice, clear and emotionally raw, began to tell the story of a granddaughter's journey through doubt, pain, understanding, and ultimately, love. The lyrics that had been born from heartbreak were being transformed into something else entirely, a celebration of the complicated, beautiful, unbreakable bond between two women who had temporarily lost their way but had found their way back to each other. As the song progressed, Kelly noticed that many of the industry professionals in the audience were exchanging meaningful glances, the kind of silent communication that happens when experienced ears recognize genuine talent. But more importantly, she could see her grandmother's face radiant with pride and love, and Kelly knew that whatever came next in her life, she would never again doubt the depth of their connection. When the final notes of Grandma's Shadow faded into silence, the studio remained completely quiet for what felt like an eternity. Kelly's heart pounded as she waited for some kind of reaction, her vulnerability hanging in the air like morning mist. Then, slowly, the silence was broken by the sound of someone clapping, not the polite applause of a formal audience, but the deep rhythmic clapping of someone who had been genuinely moved by what they had just experienced. It was Reba, her face streaked with tears but her eyes shining with an intensity that Kelly had never seen before. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," she said, her voice carrying across the studio with the clarity that had made her famous. "And I'm not saying that because you're my granddaughter. I'm saying that because you just performed a song that would make seasoned professionals weep with envy." The rest of the audience erupted into applause that felt different from any Kelly had ever received. This wasn't the encouraging clapping that adults give to children's performances. This was the genuine appreciation of industry professionals who had just witnessed something extraordinary. Faith Hill was wiping tears from her eyes. Tim McGraw was nodding with the kind of respect usually reserved for established artists. And Carrie Underwood was applauding with an enthusiasm that suggested she had just discovered her next favorite song. "Kelly?" came a voice from the back of the studio. "That was absolutely incredible." Kelly turned to see a woman she didn't recognize pushing through the crowd, her expression one of professional excitement mixed with personal emotion. "I'm Lisa Patterson from Big Machine Records, and I have to tell you, in 20 years of working in this industry, I rarely hear raw talent like what you just displayed." Kelly felt her breath catch in her throat. Big Machine Records was one of the most prestigious labels in country music, home to artists she had idolized for years. The fact that their representative was speaking to her with such enthusiasm felt surreal, like something that happened to other people in stories she read about in music magazines. Reba moved closer to Kelly, placing a protective hand on her granddaughter's shoulder. "Lisa, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but Kelly is only 16. Any discussions about her future need to include her family and careful consideration of what's best for her education and personal development." Lisa nodded respectfully, but her eyes remained focused on Kelly with the intensity of someone who recognized a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. "Of course, absolutely. But Reba, you know as well as I do that talent like this doesn't come along often. We would be honored to have conversations about Kelly's future when she and your family feel ready." As Kelly tried to process the magnitude of what was happening, she noticed that similar conversations were beginning to happen throughout the studio. Producers were quietly introducing themselves to Sarah. Managers were exchanging business cards with subtle nods toward Kelly, and several established artists were approaching with genuine compliments and offers to collaborate. "This is overwhelming," Kelly whispered to her grandmother, feeling simultaneously exhilarated and terrified by the sudden attention. "I know, sweetheart," Reba replied quietly, "and this is exactly why I was trying to protect you from this world until you were ready. But watching you perform just now, seeing the way you commanded that room and touched every heart in here, I think you might be more ready than I gave you credit for." Marcus appeared beside them, but for the first time in Kelly's memory, his expression was one of genuine excitement rather than professional calculation. "Reba, I have to admit, when you first told me about this plan months ago, I thought you were being overly sentimental. But after what I just witnessed, I think Kelly might be the most naturally gifted performer I've seen in a decade." The admission from Marcus, who Kelly knew was notoriously difficult to impress, felt like validation from an unexpected source. But before she could respond, Reba gestured for the crowd's attention, moving toward the small stage that had been set up for the occasion. "If I could have everyone's attention for just a moment," Reba announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding large audiences. "First, I want to thank everyone for being part of this incredible celebration for my granddaughter Kelly. Your presence here tonight means more to our family than you could possibly know." The crowd quieted respectfully, but Kelly could sense an anticipation in the air that suggested her grandmother had more to reveal. "Many of you know that I've been working on a special project for the past several months," Reba continued. "Something that I hoped would be meaningful not just for Kelly, but for other young people with dreams similar to hers. Tonight feels like the perfect time to share what that project is." Kelly felt her heart racing as she realized that despite all the surprises that had already been revealed, there was apparently more to come. She glanced at her mother, who was smiling through tears with an expression that suggested she knew what was about to be announced. Reba reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew an envelope, the same envelope Kelly had noticed her holding when she first walked into the studio. "Kelly, sweetheart, would you join me up here?" Kelly's legs felt unsteady as she walked toward the stage, the eyes of dozens of music industry professionals following her every step. When she reached her grandmother's side, Reba wrapped an arm around her waist, both as a gesture of support and as a way to keep her close for what was clearly going to be an emotional moment. "Kelly, for the past 2 years, I've been working with the Nashville Music Education Foundation to establish something very special," Reba began, her voice thick with emotion. "The Kelly Thompson Scholarship for Young Songwriters is a full 4-year scholarship to Berklee College of Music, specifically designed for talented young people who show exceptional promise in songwriting and performance." Kelly felt the world tilt around her as she tried to process what she was hearing. A scholarship in her name? At Berklee College of Music, the institution she had dreamed of attending but never thought would be financially possible. "But that's not all," Reba continued, her smile widening as she saw the shock and joy on her granddaughter's face. "I've also been working with several people in this room to create opportunities for the scholarship recipient to gain real-world experience in the music industry. Kelly, you are the first recipient of this scholarship, and if you choose to accept it, you'll have the chance to spend your summers working with some of Nashville's most respected producers and songwriters." The applause that erupted from the crowd was deafening, but Kelly barely heard it. She was staring at her grandmother with a mixture of disbelief, gratitude, and overwhelming love that made it difficult to breathe, let alone speak. "There's one more thing," Reba said, opening the envelope and withdrawing a contract that looked official and important. Several industry professionals here tonight have collaborated to offer you something unprecedented for someone your age, the opportunity to record and release your first EP, with all proceeds going toward expanding the scholarship program for other young songwriters. Kelly's knees buckled, and she had to grab her grandmother's arm to keep from falling. This was beyond anything she had ever dared to dream. Not only was she being offered the education she had always wanted, but she was being given the chance to actually make a professional recording while still in high school. "Grandma, I don't know what to say," Kelly managed, her voice choked with emotion. "This is incredible, but why? Why would you do all this?" Reba cupped Kelly's face in her hands, looking directly into her granddaughter's eyes with an intensity that made the rest of the room disappear. "Because 2 years ago, you sent me 3 songs that showed me you have something special, something that this world needs to hear. I tried to protect you from this industry because I know how difficult it can be, but I realize now that I was wrong. My job isn't to protect you from your destiny, Kelly. My job is to help you reach it safely." The hug that followed was the kind of embrace that heals old wounds and creates new possibilities. Kelly felt years of hurt and misunderstanding melt away, replaced by a love that felt stronger than ever before. The crowd around them erupted into applause again, but this time Kelly was dimly aware that phones were capturing the moment, that this embrace between grandmother and granddaughter was already being shared with the world. When they finally pulled apart, Reba had one final surprise. "Kelly, there's someone else here who wanted to be part of this celebration, someone who has been following your story and wanted to offer his support." Kelly turned to see a figure emerging from the back of the crowd, and her heart nearly stopped when she recognized Keith Urban, one of her musical heroes, carrying his guitar and wearing a smile that suggested he was genuinely excited to be there. "Happy birthday, Kelly," Keith said as he approached the stage. "Your grandmother played me your demos a few months ago, and I've been looking forward to meeting the young woman behind those incredible songs. I was wondering if you might be interested in singing one of those original songs as a duet. I brought my guitar, and I'd be honored to accompany you." As Kelly looked around the studio, at her grandmother's proud face, at her mother's tearful smile, at the dozens of industry professionals who were looking at her with respect and anticipation, she realized that this moment was more than just a birthday celebration. It was the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one where she would no longer live in anyone's shadow, but would create her own light to share with the world. The 16-year-old girl who had woken up that morning feeling forgotten and unworthy was gone forever, replaced by a young woman who finally understood that love sometimes expresses itself in ways that are difficult to recognize but are ultimately more profound than anything she could have imagined. As she took Keith Urban's outstretched hand and prepared to sing with one of country music's biggest stars, Kelly knew that her real journey was just beginning, but this time she wouldn't be walking it alone.